The China debate is getting pretty ugly in Canberra. China is rattling our chain, taking action against our industries. And as usual, there are too many people in this country happy to back criticism from China rather than take Australia's side. It all stems from Scott Morrison's perfectly reasonable, in fact, imperative suggestion of a thorough and independent investigation into the origins of the coronavirus pandemic. China hates this. Despite unquestionably being the source of the virus and despite being exposed for trying to hide its very existence, China denies its culpability and is angered by those pointing the finger of blame its way, especially Donald Trump. So Australia's call for an investigation ought to be welcomed as a sensible step, diffusing the blame game and focusing on just gaining the knowledge we need. Labor's Andrew Leigh yesterday could have said something like that, could have strongly backed Australia, but he went for the cheap shot, telling the ABC that when you act on your own, you do find yourself being back in that realm of John Howard, that John Howard found himself in with the infamous Deputy Sheriff's statement. And even Gareth Evans, Labor's longest-serving Foreign Minister, emerged from retirement to use the same taunt.
It was ill thought through operationally, it was ill prepared diplomatically, and it played right into that stereotype of Australia as a deputy sheriff to the US.
Now, this sort of attack does not serve the national interest. In fact, it doesn't even serve Labor's interest because voters would prefer Labor to be in Australia's corner. It's just a cheap attack that will amuse many on the fashionable left and, of course, please Beijing.
Well, if the Labor Party want to share the criticisms of Australia by our critics, then I think that is really something for them to reflect on. We have always been independent, we have always pursued our national interest, and we always will.
Look, does Labor have the right to criticise management of foreign policy? Of course it does. They're right, for instance, to criticise Foreign Minister Marise Payne's failure to lead on this, or for that matter, any other foreign policy issue. But beyond that, Labor is essentially, in this case, talking Australia down. They're suggesting we should not publicly support something as obvious and crucial as an inquiry into the pandemic without first winning approval from the UN or the G20 or perhaps the US. How feeble and how demeaning for Australia. China can be a bully, and not just to us. Just ask Japan. Just ask Vietnam, ask India or Malaysia. Labor MPs, business leaders, state premiers and commentators should stop pretending that every time China takes aim at us, we must be at fault. On the contrary, sometimes we draw a backlash precisely because we're right. Now, of course, we need to be focused, fair and careful. We don't want unnecessary strife with China. We want Beijing to accept an investigation, not as an exercise in blame, but as an exercise in finding out what China and the rest of the world need to know. But if the aim is to take the heat out of the diplomacy at the moment and to avoid this becoming a partisan domestic political issue, Labor isn't helping there either. One senator has tarred coalition backbenchers with Trumpian tendencies, and apparently he doesn't even need an investigation to know that the virus could not have escaped from that Chinese lab.
President Trump, of course, and Senator Vance quite right about this, has been intent on blaming the China for the pandemic. He calls the COVID-19 the Chinese disease and claims to have seen very strong evidence, quote unquote, that the virus originated in the Wuhan Insitute of Virology. Now, such language can only serve to inflame racism and xenophobia.
Racism and xenophobia now. We're talking about a global pandemic and finding out what went on. Now, in fact, Senator Carr is so fired up about anyone raising a possible accidental release of the virus from the Wuhan Insitute of Virology that he's compared those journalists and politicians doing that to Nazis.
Now, this is a new low, even in the long history of shameful attacks on science by members of this government. It recalls the campaigns directed against science by the far-right politicians in Europe in the 1930s, Campaigns that also shrugged off any need for evidence. Campaigns run by people who assured us that if you keep repeating a slur, however ill-founded, sooner or later people will believe it.
This is terrible stuff, especially when you consider the journalist he is mainly targeting, our own Sharri Markson, happens to be Jewish. So we have an Australian Labor Party senator invoking the Nazis in order to defend China from a full investigation into a pandemic that so far has killed 300,000 people around the world and has tipped millions of Australians out of work. Thankfully, however, the Australian Workers' Union, one of the nation's most powerful and sensible unions, has spoken up. It's written to the Prime Minister urging him to stand up to China and not to be bullied. Well done to the AWU, a union living up to its name and its slogan, Stronger Together.